Hi everyone, this is Mindy. Thanks for joining me today. I am creating this card in the video and I thought I would go over my top embossing tools that I use when I'm embossing, whether it's an image or a sentiment. So first I need to create the card. For this, I am using the Best Year Yet stamp set, Howdy, and the Modern Postage Stencil. I'm going to stamp out a few images from the Howdy stamp set. I place them onto some Express It paper that I have placed in my mini Misti, and I'm just rubbing my hand over the stamps to kind of condition them so that they take ink better. And then I'm going to ink them up in the Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, which is alcohol marker friendly. Then, even though I conditioned my stamp, I am still going to stamp this one more time to make sure I have some really crisp lines. Typically, if I'm using a stamp set I had never used before, I will stamp it twice, which is why it's nice to have the Misti on hand for that. Now I'm going to color in my images using my Copic markers. Now, I am not a Copic marker expert. I am not Alberto, which is a phenomenal artist when it comes to coloring with alcohol markers, but I enjoy the process. I will have my color choices listed at the top of the screen here and also on my blog if you want to reference that. Now, when I come in to do coloring with my markers, I try to pick at least one side to have a shadow area. I had a general idea about where this was going to go on my card, wasn't really sure yet where the light source was going to come from. So I put the shadow onto the left-hand side of the posts. And then also for the bars or the posts that go across, I put the shadow down towards the bottom. I'm going to use that same brown color combination for my cowgirl's hair. And with that, I started with the darkest color, just kind of adding flicks to give it some contrast, and then blending it out actually with only two more colors. So I didn't use the full four color combination, I only went to three. Now I'm going to bring in some grays to do my rocks. And I try to reuse my colors as much as I can throughout my images so I don't have to keep digging through my markers and bringing in a whole pile of markers. So I also used that gray for her cowboy boots. And then I'm going to color in the blue jeans, which I only used two color combination here. I did B99 and B95. I also used that same color combination for the handkerchief around her neck. Can't remember what it's called, but I used it for the handkerchief around her neck. And then I brought in a red color combination to do the shirt. I moved on to the skin, so I used E04 as my shadow and I added that right under the hairline and then blended out with E11 and E01. For the cowboy hat, I did come in with another brown combination. So this is E79, E77, and E74. I struggled a little bit with where exactly to put my highlight areas. And then once I have this hat done, I'm going to move on to coloring the cactus. And I really wanted the cactus to kind of brighten up my scene a little bit because I had an idea about what I was going to do for the background. So for the cactus, I did a G28, G24, and then really packed a punch with the YG01 as the highlight area. And then for the flowers on top, I just picked some random bright pink marker and pretty much just added dots to color in the flowers. I'll use the coordinating dies to die cut out the images, and then I also die cut out another set using some plain white cardstock. I do enjoy coloring on Express It cardstock. I think it's really great for blending for alcohol markers, but it is a little bit on the thinner side. I can't remember the weight of it, but I like to add additional support by having another piece of cardstock, even if I'm going to be using foam squares. So I just attach these using some liquid glue and, of course, my tweezers. Now that my images are ready, I can work on my background. One of the reasons I started with my images is sometimes I pick colors that don't really match a background that I had already created. So I've kind of learned that I color my images first, and then that way I can kind of tweak my background to match my coloring. I already took a piece of Hammermill cardstock and added repositionable tape behind it to hold it down onto my magnetic work surface. I took out one of these postage, it's modern postage stencils. This has got the biggest opening on it, and there were some borders there on the right-hand side. I covered that with post-it tape because I didn't want any of my ink to get underneath that. Then I'm going to come in and start doing my ink blending. So I'm using a flat blending brush, and this is Morning Ink from Simon Says Stamps. So it's a very nice light blue, not like a true blue, but kind of a dusty blue, which I thought was really pretty and would work really well for the nighttime sky that I wanted to do. So once I have that blended on, I'm coming in with a Galaxy ink, which is a couple steps darker or a few shades darker. I'm starting off at the top and I'm going to blend down into that lighter blue that I applied. A little bit tricky here. This is about the only time that my magnets get in my way is because I really needed it to hold down my stencil, but yet they were just kind of in my way. I probably should have grabbed more of a sticky work surface to hold the stencil down, but this still works. So now that I have my sky blended, I'm going to come in with a latte ink. So this is going to be my ground. And notice I'm not really starting down at the bottom. I'm coming in a little ways up, but not blending into the blue. I'm going to leave kind of a light, maybe a light haze where it's just barely touching that light blue. And I prefer that. I think that gives it more of a highlight area on where the ground and the sky would meet. So once I have that light brown down, I'm going to come in with cappuccino, which you can see I had to tap off quite a bit of ink because that was pretty intense. And this one I started off of the stencil and worked my way up so I didn't overtake that light brown that I had just done. Leaving my stencil in place, I'm going to mask off the bottom portion of my card front here. And I'm going to be adding splatters, no big surprise, to that background to kind of give the look of stars. So I just have some white paint that I mixed in with some water and I'm tapping that over that area. Now, this is still wet, so I'm just going to be really careful when I remove my Post-it notes and my stencil. I don't want to risk smearing that ink that I just put down. So I just carefully remove that and then I'm left with this beautiful white margin going around this kind of postage stamp type of frame. I'm going to be using a sentiment from the stamp set Best Year Yet, and I wanted to point this out because I didn't notice this at first. So for one, birthday stamps are super versatile and great to have in your stash. They do have coordinating dies for a lot of the images and larger sentiments, but they also have dies for those smaller sentiments, which I absolutely love. Now, for heat embossing, these are the top tools that I personally recommend. I have my Misti, which I almost always stamp with. I have an anti-static powder tool, and Simon Says Stamp just came out with these clothespins, which I think are really fun. They have kind of some engraved sentiments on there, so you can use regular clothespins, of course, but these are just super cute. You need an embossing ink, which is Versamark. It's a sticky ink, and then you need some embossing powder. So I will talk about each of these as I go through. Now I'm using a sentiment off of that Best Year Yet stamp set. I'm placing that down onto my cardstock. I'm going to prep that once again with my hand so it accepts ink better. And then what you need to do is prep your cardstock. This step is super important. You need a type of anti-static powder tool. There are a couple of them out there. This one is from Simon Says Stamp. It's really nice and kind of compact and handy, doesn't take up a lot of room. But what this does is help remove any oil or dirt or anything you can't see on your cardstock. This will also help where your embossing powder should only be sticking to the embossing ink, which we're moving into right now. The Versamark is kind of an all-around great embossing ink. A lot of companies have their own embossing ink. All it really is a sticky ink that will stay wet a little bit longer. So I'm stamping this down. I'm not pushing real hard. The Misti is going to allow me to stamp this again. I personally like to stamp with my embossing ink at least 2 times, 3 if I get a chance to. But the Misti is helping it keep everything in place so I can stamp it again. Another ink that is great to use for embossing is a pigment ink because it is so thick and does stay wet longer. So I have used that before too. Now you're going to need embossing powder, and what I like to do is sprinkle this over the top of my stamped area. Now I am holding it flat and tapping it to really let the embossing powder kind of settle into that ink and then tilt my card and tap it off. I have found this super helpful versus just pouring it on and dumping it right away. I really let that embossing powder get into that ink that I had just stamped. Now there are lots of tools to catch your embossing powder. A lot of times I'm just using a sheet of paper so I can funnel it back into my jar and then close my jar right away so I don't risk spilling it. Next, you are going to need a heat gun, which I guess I should have shown in my earlier display, but a heat tool. This one is from Wow. It has two different settings. It has a low setting and a high setting. For heat embossing, you want the high setting. I like this one because it has that guard on the front, so you don't risk that getting bumped and burning your arm. Now, you want to let this heat up. I would say, I don't know, I never really timed it, but however long you think you're good enough, I'd say give it another extra 20 seconds. Then I come in, I just briefly go on the back of the cardstock and then come to the front and let that melt. So the less time you spend heat embossing that, the less warping you're going to get. Now, notice I am holding my cardstock with the clothespin. That's just keeping my hands away from that heat because they get really super hot. And then I can just use the coordinating die to die cut out the sentiment. I also cut it out about 3 more times so I can layer it up together to add dimension. Now, as far as the heat embossing that I just went over, now you may see in my videos that the tools may vary, and that really is just a matter of what I found handy or what was in my grasp first or what I reached for first. They all work pretty much the same. You just really want to make sure you kind of follow along those main steps that I had pointed out. Now, back to my card, I went ahead and created a side folding card base. I scored it so it is going to be 4¼ by 5½. Reinforced the fold with my bone folder, added tape runner to the top, and then I can attach my background. So now I have it on a card base, which I very rarely do, and I can start assembling the front of my card. I'm going to place my fence really down towards the bottom. I need to make sure I'm leaving room for my sentiment. So I just added some liquid glue for that. And I just placed my girl on the top there so I knew exactly where she was going to go. And I'm adding thin foam squares behind this cactus. And I'm being strategic about where I put it. I'm placing the foam squares on the area that it's not overlapping the fence because I do have that one layer of cardstock behind there. Remember, I die cut out extra pieces. So same thing with the girl. I am just strategically placing those thin foam squares on the areas that are not going to touch the fence. And then I can add liquid glue to those other open areas and place them down on where I want them on the front of the card. Then I can come in, add the sentiment towards the top. Now this one, I had added about 3 more layers behind it, so it's already got that dimension to it. I just added liquid glue and placed that right above my cowgirl's head. Now I just really had to embellish this. I have these kind of sparkly gems. I looked and looked and looked on where these came from or what they were because I didn't have them labeled. I could not find them. I'm so sorry, but any sparkly embellishment would work here. So I placed them around my sentiment, put everything back in the jar so I don't spill everything, and then using my place and pierce tool to pick them up and put a little dab of glue down and then add my gem back over the top of the glue. Now my last finishing touch is coming in with a white Jelly Roll pen and just adding some highlights around the cowboy hat and the hair, just kind of having her stand out a little bit more. And then that's going to finish up the card project. I really enjoyed putting this together. I haven't done a full Copic colored image like this in a while. I really enjoyed the process of it. I think the card turned out great, and I hope these embossing tips help you when it comes to heat embossing your images and your sentiments. I will have all of my supplies listed down below in the video description and over on my blog as well. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I'll see you again real soon.